Hi, everyone. Welcome to the symposium, When Institutions Are Barriers, How Contextual Cues and Institutional Bias Shape Success Among Stigmatized Groups. I'm Stephanie Reeves. I'm a PhD student at the University of Waterloo. I'm very excited to be chairing this session today. I want to thank my co-chair, Dr. David Yeager, who is an assistant professor at the University of Texas. Unfortunately, David is not able to be here today because he just had a new baby in his family. But one of the reasons that we wanted to have this symposium is that recently research on stereotype or social identity threat has been shifting from thinking about threat as something that's happening inside of targets' minds to something that's actually triggered by the social environment. So in this session, our speakers will present what I think are some very exciting studies showing how a variety of institutional or contextual cues can shape outcomes for members of stigmatized groups. First, I will be discussing how bureaucratic hassles in college can take on threatening meaning for first-generation students, undermining their sense of belonging and achievement in college. Second, we will have Dr. Katie Boucher, who is an assistant professor at the University of Indianapolis. Katie will present research on how STEM instructors' theories about the nature of intelligence or abilities can affect motivation and performance for female students. Our third speaker is Dr. Jeff Cohen, who is a professor in the School of Education and in the psychology department at Stanford University. Jeff will be presenting a 7-year longitudinal study showing how awareness of bias in school discipline policies can lead to the development of distrust among middle school students of color, ultimately undermining their college enrollment years later. Our fourth speaker is Ryan Svoboda, who is a PhD student at Northwestern University working with Mesmin Dustin. Ryan will present work showing how messages about college finances can shape motivation among middle school students of low socioeconomic status. And for the sake of time in this session, we're actually going to hold off all questions until the very end, and then we'll have all the speakers come up, and you can ask questions then. So with that, let's start off with our first talk, which is my talk. So the focus of my talk today is how bureaucratic hassles in college can lead to reduced sense of belonging and achievement among first-generation students. So I want to start off by reading for you a brief quote about one former student's experiences transitioning to college. When I first arrived at school as a first-generation college student, I didn't know anyone on campus except my brother. I didn't know how to pick the right classes or find the right buildings. I didn't even bring the right size sheets for my dorm room bed. I didn't realize those beds were so long. And so I was a little overwhelmed and a little isolated. And this former student is actually our First Lady, Michelle Obama. And I think what's interesting about her story is that these really mundane experiences, things that the majority of college students go through, seem to have a really subjectively threatening meaning for her and seem to shape her experiences of the transition to college more generally. And this is really the phenomenon that I'm going to be discussing in today's talk. Despite increases in access to college, large disparities in college completion rates persist. First-generation students, or those students who are the first in their families to attend college, are about half as likely as their more advantaged peers to graduate from college. Traditional explanations for these gaps have focused on things like differences in academic preparation or study skills, or structural barriers like the need to balance work with academics. But these gaps persist even above and beyond things like prior performance and structural factors. And there is increasing consensus in the field that additional social psychological factors may undermine achievement. Perhaps most prominent among these is social identity threat, or the concern that one could be devalued on the basis of their social identity. While most research on social identity threat has focused on women in STEM or students of color, pioneering work by Nicole Stevens and Mesmin Dustin has shown that social identity threat similarly affects first-generation students. One consequence of social identity threat is to cause students to question the quality of their social ties in school, or to experience belonging uncertainty. And what this belonging uncertainty does is create a sense of ambiguity about the meaning of academic and social adversity. So because these students are aware that their group has been marginalized in college, they form a broad hypothesis that people like them might not belong in college. Then, when they experience things like difficulty making friends or receiving critical feedback from a professor, they view it not as a ubiquitous aspect of the transition to college, but rather as a sign that they don't belong in college more generally. Over time, such concerns can lead to decreased engagement in college and ultimately lower achievement. So what are the antecedents of social identity threat and belonging uncertainty? A number of studies have now shown that subtle institutional or contextual cues can trigger a threat. And this includes things like the perception that one's group is numerically underrepresented in the setting, whether an institution endorses a colorblind or a multicultural diversity philosophy, physical environments that are consistent with STEM stereotypes, and whether the institution seems to endorse an entity theory of ability. Among first-generation students in particular, cues emphasizing independent cultural norms can trigger threat. In the present research, we'll build on this previous work on the antecedents of social identity threat and look at a new type of institutional cue that might trigger threat among first-gen students. Specifically, we propose that bureaucratic hassles or difficulties that are associated with the structures or procedures of the institution will trigger threat among first-gen students. Some examples of bureaucratic hassles include confusing course requirements or complicated financial aid forms. Ostensibly, these types of difficulties apply to all students in college. That is, they don't single out any particular group, and they're frustrating for all students. However, we suggest that they may carry a particularly threatening meaning for first-generation students. First-gen students do not have parents with college degrees, and so they may worry that they lack the insider knowledge that can be really important to navigating the college experience. Then, when they encounter bureaucratic hassles, they may view them not as normal aspects of the transition to college, but rather as evidence that they don't belong in college more generally. So what do these bureaucratic hassles look like? Well, they look like this really confusing course requirements flowchart. This is a real flowchart from a real four-year college, and I found it just by searching online. And in case you're thinking that this is just a particularly complicated example, we can look at this one, or this one, or this one, or this one. So I want you to imagine what a student who's transitioning to college, who might wonder if he has what it takes to succeed there and can't go to parents or family to help him figure things out, would think about a flowchart like this one. Well, for one thing, he would probably think that it's going to be very difficult to choose which courses to take. But he might also think, if I'm having this much difficulty choosing my courses in college, maybe I don't belong in college after all, and maybe I can't do well here. So in light of these possibilities, we hypothesize, first, that bureaucratic challenges will undermine sense of belonging among first-generation students, but not among continuing generation students. And second, that over time, bureaucratic challenges will lead to reduced academic achievement in college for first-gen students. And we're going to test these hypotheses in a series of 3 studies. In study 1, we examine whether exposure to a frustrating bureaucratic hassle would reduce sense of belonging among first-generation students. Our participants in this study were freshmen at 2 large public universities. And in this study, participants came into the lab and completed either a frustrating or non-frustrating web form that was ostensibly something that their university was pilot testing. Next, they completed a survey assessing sense of belonging in college, as well as a number of other measures. And we're choosing to focus on sense of belonging because it's a very important predictor of academic achievement in college, as well as a number of other important outcomes, including health and well-being. This is the web form manipulation. Here's the first page, and you can see that it just asks for basic biographical information. This student has gone through and carefully entered all of their information, and then in the non-frustrating version, they can move on with no issues. In the frustrating version, the student submits the page and gets this error message. it says that their password did not meet the requirements, and all of the information they entered on the previous page is lost. And this happens on every page of the form in the frustrating condition. As I'm sure all of you can imagine, this is extremely frustrating to students. So here are the results for our main DV, sense of belonging in college. On the y-axis, we have sense of belonging. Here are the results among continuing generation students, and you can see that our web form manipulation didn't have any effect on their sense of belonging. But when we look at first generation students, we see that the frustrating web form reduced sense of belonging, and this is consistent with our predictions. So to summarize study 1, the frustrating bureaucratic task led to reduced sense of belonging among the first generation students, but not among continuing generation students. Now we'll move on to the second study. Study 2 was a conceptual replication of study 1 among first generation community college students with a slightly different way of manipulating bureaucratic challenge. Our participants in this study were first-gen community college students, and this was an online study in which participants were first asked to complete either a simple or confusing course selection task, and this is the new manipulation of bureaucratic challenge. Next, participants completed our measure of sense of belonging in college. Here is the bureaucratic challenge manipulation. Here we're taking a more face-valid approach to bureaucratic challenge by simulating challenges students face with course selection in college. In both conditions, students are asked to view a hypothetical course requirement flowchart and list all of the courses that they would need in order to graduate. In the simple version, they use the flowchart on the left, and in the complicated version, they use the flowchart on the right. Both versions have the same total number of requirements, but the complicated version presents these requirements in a far more confusing format. Notably, unlike the previous study, students are not led to believe that these materials are actually coming from their college. Rather, they're told that they were hypothetical flowcharts. And so in some ways, this is a more conservative test of the effects of bureaucratic challenges. Here are the results for our sense of belonging measure. On the y-axis, we have sense of belonging, and here are the students who completed the simple course selection task. And here are the students who completed the complicated course selection task. So again, we see that the complicated bureaucratic hassle led to reduced sense of belonging among first-gen students. To summarize study 2, with a sample of first-gen community college students, we found that a different bureaucratic challenge manipulation, that is, a simple or complicated hypothetical course selection task, undermines sense of belonging. Moving on to our third and final study, study 3 was a longitudinal field study in which we examined the effects of students' perceptions of real bureaucratic challenge in their college on their sense of belonging and also their actual college retention. Our participants in this study were first-gen community college students, and this study consisted of 2 online survey sessions. The first was completed during the second week of the term and consisted first of baseline measures that asked students to report both their belonging uncertainty and their experiences with bureaucratic challenges in college. In this session, students also completed our measure of sense of belonging. The second session was completed during the 5th week of the term and consisted of a battery of self-report measures, including sense of belonging again. Finally, we collected college retention, that is, whether students were still enrolled at their college 1 year later. Here are the results for the relationship between perceptions of bureaucratic challenges in college and sense of belonging. So we're first going to look at the second week of the term. And these bars represent means at -1 and +1 standard deviations. And as expected, we see that there is a significant effect of initial perceptions of bureaucratic hassle on overall sense of belonging in college, such that students who subjectively experienced more bureaucratic hassle had lower sense of belonging in college. When we look at the results for the second study session, we see that this difference is maintained 5 weeks later. So of course, this is correlational, and we're not making any strong causal claims. But these results suggest that the effects of bureaucracy are not limited to manipulated bureaucratic challenge, but extend to students' perceptions of real bureaucratic challenges as well. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the talk, we know from previous research that sense of belonging is a very important self-report DV. But we also wanted to see whether hassles would predict an actual behavioral outcome that we care about. So belonging seems to be something that's different between those high and low experiences of bureaucratic hassle. So might these 2 variables interact to predict retention? That is, do bureaucratic hassles and belonging interact to predict whether first-gen students are in college 1 year later? So let me show you what we have for retention. And again, this is 1 year after the study took place. On the y-axis, we have percent of students who are still enrolled at their college, and on the x-axis is belonging uncertainty at -1 and +1 standard deviations. And when we look at those who are low in belonging uncertainty, we see that bureaucratic challenges do not predict retention. But among those high in baseline belonging uncertainty, hassles predict lower retention. So if you're sure that you belong in college, it doesn't really matter if you experience bureaucratic hassles. But if you're uncertain whether you belong in college, as many first-generation students are, those who experience more bureaucratic hassles are less likely to be enrolled in college 1 year later. And these findings are consistent with a theoretical model that I laid out at the beginning, whereby belonging uncertainty gives a threatening meaning to commonplace bureaucratic hassles and ultimately undermines institutional success. So to summarize, among first-generation community college students, we found that students' self-reported experiences with actual bureaucratic challenges at their college predicted sense of belonging up to 5 weeks later. In addition, we find that first-gen students who subjectively experience a lot of bureaucracy and are also uncertain of their belonging in college are the least likely to be enrolled 1 year later. So what this research shows is that these two variables, bureaucratic hassle and belonging uncertainty, when put together, seem to be a really problematic combination that ultimately leads to lower college persistence for first-gen students. So to conclude, in 2 experimental studies, bureaucratic challenges led to reduced sense of belonging in college among first-generation students. In a longitudinal field study, we show that these effects extend to real bureaucratic challenges as well. In addition, we find that the mix of bureaucratic challenges and belonging uncertainty predicted increased dropout rates for first-gen students. So although bureaucratic hassles in college are typically thought of as simple frustrations that all students face, this work suggests that they could actually contribute to social class achievement gaps in college. This work has implications for strategies to reduce achievement gaps. Specifically, it suggests that traditional strategies like increasing representation or reducing bias, while very helpful and important, may not be enough. This work suggests that it may also be important to address institutional cues like bureaucracies that from an outsider's perspective may seem objectively neutral. To the extent that such cues create different and threatening experiences for members of stigmatized groups, these institutional cues will likely reinforce disadvantage over time. I want to conclude by thanking my collaborators, Mary Murphy and David Yeager, and all of the other people that contributed to this research in one way or another, the Carnegie Foundation for funding our project, and all of you for listening. So thanks so much. Just as a reminder, we're going to save all questions to the very end. And with that, I want to turn it over to the next speaker, Dr. Katie Boucher.